this afternoon. Today's speaker is Dr. Shinobu Kitayama, who's one of our own Ph.D. students in the social psychology program. He has started whole fields. So he helped start the field of cultural psychology, and we were able to hire him back in the mid-2000s, back to Michigan. And what he did when he came back is start another field, cultural neuroscience.
No, I'm destroying it.
And Shinobu was one of the 3 or 4 people that were very instrumental in the planning stages of the BioSocial Methods collaborative. In terms of trying to think about how we need to develop new methods to be able to integrate multiple levels of biology and behavioral science data and try to get better answers to our research questions. And so it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Shinobu Kitayama.
Oh, thank you, Rich. Thank you so much. It's very, very exciting to share what I'm up to in this home audience. It's a little scary whenever you give a talk in a home stadium, you have to see those people the next day. So, but we'll see how we can do. I can do. So today I'm going to discuss some new ideas, particularly ideas related to biosocial approach to culture. So what I'd like to do is to give you a very quick review of what we have accomplished in the last 20 years or so, and then move on to discuss where cultural differences I'm going to discuss might come from. So I'm going to discuss both ecology and some little bit of genetics. So that's the general plan. So over the last 20 years, Hazel, Marcus, Dick Nisbet, I and many other people have investigated potential differences across cultures, particularly focusing on Western cultures, that is North American, mostly middle class student populations, and East Asian cultures, particularly Japanese, Korean, Chinese, college undergraduates. And general conclusion out of this, which actually generalized to ordinary people in those cultural regions to a large extent, general conclusion is that basic view or construal of the self seems very different. So in Western cultural context, there's this idea that each individual is independent, and the person is defined as an independent entity. It consists of its own internal attributes, such as goals, values, and so on, and it's considered just right to use some or all of those attributes to guide their behaviors. In contrast, in Eastern cultures, there's this idea of the person is connected with the context, and people believe this view to a greater extent, so that attention is focused more on the context, and sometimes other people are included in the self, and so on. So that's the first point. Self is often construed as more inclusive of others for Asians as compared to, say, North Americans. And here's a very simple task we used recently just to investigate this possibility. This is a flanker task, HHSHH. You have to ignore the H's, that is flanking alphabet. And then you have to say the center letter, in this case S, is either S or H. And of course, all combinations exist. And the task itself is very easy, but if you have to respond very, very quickly, sometimes you make an error. Now, we wanted to investigate whether people really work for the self and for other people as well. And in order to do this, we told people that you really have to work on this task because you can earn points. In some blocks, those points can be converted into a gift that you can keep for yourself, one of those items. On other blocks, you also have to work hard because you can convert those points for somebody else. They had nominated the best friend on campus at the beginning, and we told them that we are going to send one of the gifts that they choose to that friend. So that's the setup. And after the experiment, we always ask them how hard they worked on the task in each of those blocks. And people always say that they worked just as hard for their friends as they did for themselves. And the question is whether that's really true in terms of brain response. Now, in terms of brain response, one interesting signal is this signal called error-related negativity, which is a negative potential that happens around here whenever people make an error in a task like this. So it's an amazing thing. Bill Gehring, who showed up last week, really it was a pioneer in this area. Here's a response. Subjects are pressing either S or H in this task, and nearly simultaneously with the response, actually right before the execution of the response, this error-related potential shows up. So subjects, in some sense, subjects' brain recognizing that they are making some stupid error, even before the error itself has been registered. So this is error-related negativity, and here's nothing is happening when the response is correct. And one very nice, interesting characteristics of this is that this ERN, error-related negativity, is greater in magnitude when the task is very important. So we can use this characteristics to examine whether subjects are really working hard, just as hard for their friends as they did for themselves. You can compare the magnitudes in the self block as opposed to friend block. And here's what we found for European American subjects, undergraduates at the University of Michigan, and this is very clean error-related negativity. This is friend condition. In a self condition, this is what we got. So, well, you could say brain was honest. Evidently, they worked harder in the self condition as opposed to the friend condition. In the self condition than in the friend condition, as indicated by the magnitude of this component of brainwave.
Which one is which? What's the red is the friend?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, red is a self. And blue is a friend.
Okay.
Make sense? All right. And also one more confusing thing is that negativity goes upward. That goes against my intuition anyway. Okay. Now, we also tested Asian folks. And the idea is that Asian folks are more interdependent, meaning that good friends, close people are incorporated into the self, and if that's the case, this difference may go away. And that's exactly what we got. So in this case, there's no difference. And Jion Park, who did this study, she just accepted the job at UMass. That's great, congratulations. So that's one example of many studies we did in this field. So in the domain of cognition, Dick Nisbet and many colleagues, many actually PhDs from our program have demonstrated that attention is more holistic for Asians as opposed to European Americans. Emotions tend to be more relational. So for example, you can examine the definition of happiness, what sort of things people think about when they think about happiness, and very clearly Asians think more about the relational stuff. You know, happiness arises when you have nice conversation with their family members, relatively speaking, as compared to European Americans. And the motivation as well. Self tend to be more focal. And I think one task that is very, very, in my mind, very interesting, in part because it's so easy, involves sociogram. We ask people to write a sociogram using circle to represent yourself and also, you know, all the people included in the social network, and just connecting those circles by line. And one key dependent variable is just the circle, size of the circle. And as it turned out, American selves are just so inflated as opposed to other people. And comparable effect doesn't happen among Asians. So in any case, So we did this, and for 20 years we spent this, and one effect after the other. And all those effects appear to cohere together in terms of some notion of independence, interdependence, or individualism, collectivism, and or analytic as opposed to holistic thoughts. So now, and on the top of this, in the last several years, we have used, just as in our brainwave study, we used EEG, ERP, and fMRI to investigate whether comparable effects could be found in brain responses. Now, in retrospect, whatever you can find in behavior is likely to be reflected in brain processes. Didn't you know that? Well, several years ago, I didn't know that. And after several years, we are finding just that. Now, so next really interesting question to me is a question of where those fairly stable cross-cultural differences might come from. That's my talk today is about. Now, generally speaking, ecology is important. Ecology is important. And exactly how ecology might come into play is a real interesting question. And also ecology in terms of pretty long time period, long only in comparison to our lifetime. Very, very short in comparison to evolution, of course. What happened in the case of human evolution is that anatomically modern humans were evolved, say 20 or 200 or 300,000 years ago, East Africa, and many things happened, but in the end, about 50,000 years ago, some very tiny fraction of them, well, presumably they almost were extinguished around that time. And very tiny group of humans, our ancestors, somehow, well, we could say chose to move out. Who knows? They may or may not have been Americans who choose. In any case, they decided to go out of Africa and spread all over the globe. That happened about 50,000 years ago. And then there are some debates about why this might be the case, but about 10,000 years ago, just a farming, herding began. People began to stay in a single place and began domesticating animals, domesticating plants, and harvesting crops and so on. And that's really the beginning of what we know, understand as civilizations. And why 10,000 years ago, nobody really knows. Rob Boyd, for example, suggests that's when climate became very, very stable. During the period of essentially hunter and gatherers, climate was very volatile. It was very hard to stay in a single place and do whatever you choose to do. So in any case, about 10,000 years ago, herding started, and this is one region where data are pretty well documented, exactly which kind of animals might have been domesticated initially. This is here, Anatolia region of Turkey. This is Syria, and this is Fertile Crescent. And essentially highland area in this area, basically people began domesticating animals, sheep, goat, and pigs, and cattle, and of course, probably somewhere here, camel must have been a very important animal back then. Now, herding doesn't require much social coordination. So that's one point I want to make. But around that time, also farming started. Of course, initially farming started around here. There are many different crops people evidently experimented. One most prominent one in retrospect was wheat. But there are many different crops, and they experimented in this area, essentially a fertile crescent, climate perfect, and also different, plants available, plants which can be domesticated were available, and this started, and of course, sometimes later, similar farming began, presumably independently, around China, contemporary China. And farming requires much greater extent of social coordination. And also another important thing is that you can keep crops. And therefore, presumably, that began the process of wealth accumulation. And of course, all this may have led to the production of larger social groups and eventually civilizations, which began to appear several thousand years later in similar regions. Now, is it really true that farming encouraged greater social coordination and therefore interdependence? Well, several years ago, Ayşe Usko was a postdoc here, and she came from Turkey. And Turkey is a wonderful area because our Turkey is very close to Fertile Crescent, for one thing. But at the same time, some area of Turkey are very mountainous, especially Anatolia area. And in this area facing Black Sea, basically farmers and herders and some fishermen are living together. And that's very nice because all those people are essentially sharing the same national culture and also same language, and presumably many things are in common except for what they do for a living. So we decided to look into this area and examine cognitive style of farmers as opposed to herders. And also we had fishermen too. And here's one of the tasks we used. So subjects are shown a sheet of paper on which a square like this is printed, and here's a line, and they have to look at it. And then they are shown another sheet of paper where a square is printed, just the second square is different in size. And they have to draw the same line on either one or the other criteria. One is absolute criteria. The first one is 3 centimeters long, and this one must be 3 centimeters long too. And this task is easy except for the fact that the size of the square is different. So to carry this out, you ought to be able to ignore the surrounding square. And if your attention is very focused, this task ought to be easier. Whereas in this task, subjects have to draw a line that is proportionally the same relative to the height of the surrounding square. So in this case, it's very good if you can spread your attention adequately to the context, but if you are focusing something on the target, then you may be thrown off easily. And the prediction is more interdependent people are spreading their attention more, paying closer attention to social situations and other people, and those cultural practices may influence some non-social cognitive ability like this. Now, by the way, we used this task in cross-cultural comparison, comparing Japanese and European Americans several years earlier, and found the kind of cultural difference you would expect. So here's the result. What we got is that here, a y-axis is amount of error. So larger the error, more difficult the task was. And across the board, absolute task was more difficult in this group. However, relatively speaking, that effect was strongest for fishermen and also farmers. And for herders, that effect was a little bit weaker. I mean, statistically significantly weaker. So this is consistent with the idea that, relatively speaking, herding might encourage more independence and therefore more focused attention. Now, here's a task that is very old. Actually, this was used Luria and Vygotsky in Central Asia almost a century ago. And the idea is that basically subjects have to say that this target might go with A or B. Some people are analytic And therefore, they look into some semantic categories which sort things out. Whereas some other people are more relational, so that they look into the relationship between between two objects. And if you look into semantic category, of course, you have to say that those two go together both ways. But if you look into relationship, you look into this. And again, this task has been used a number of times before, and interdependent agents tend to use more thematic or relational criterion, whereas more analytic, more independent American folks do just the opposite. And what we got is, again, harder, more semantic. And finally, this is the task Ara Norenzayan created in collaboration with Nick Nisbet. And subjects, again, have to say that this target objects might belong to this group or that group. Do you see the point of this task? Well, if you are very analytic, you look into a defining feature. Single feature that distinguish. And if you use that criterion, after a while, it's very clear that curviness of the stem, or single stem or curved stem, are the only feature that distinguish between those two groups. So given that, clearly this target belongs to group A. However, stimuli offers a trick so that generally, in terms of family resemblance, target object resembles more to group B. Right? And many people are thrown off in that way if you are very holistic. I don't know if it's really right to say that A is the correct answer, just that this is a diagnostic tool to examine which way you might think. And as it turned out, herders tend to use rule-based criterion much more than fishermen or farmers.
Which one did the herders choose?
Oh, herders tend to choose this one, rule-based. So the reasoning is that herders tend to be more independent. Independent people tend to look into some rules or categories, and more analytic. That's how Nisbet would say.
And family resemblance, because they're like faces? I mean, we could say the family resemblance is the curved stems, right? So.
Oh, family resemblance, well, general overall similarity, no single feature defines this grouping, but you know, so this one belongs to this, but not this, and this one belongs to this, but not this. And in that way, if you try to apply rule, clearly group 2 is wrong. There's always contradiction. But if you look overall, oh yeah, group 2 is more similar. Okay? All right, now, which is your favorite? Well, some people say this. Some other people might say this. You know, Kelch is wonderful. Single malt is wonderful. Sake is even better. However, this is not really the right kind of classification. Actually, those three belong to one civilization, and the other three belong to the other civilization, and one is a Western civilization, and the other one is Asian civilization. But one deeper criterion or feature associated with this is that which foods or which alcohol are based on rice or wheat. All those beer and croissant and single malt whiskey, those are all based on some kinds of wheat. And there's good reason why, if you really want to have a good beer, better to go to Germany. Well, on one day I discovered that Kelch is available in Pacific Rim. However, probably it's better to go all the way to Germany. And the same applies to croissant or baguette. And just the same argument can be made for rice noodles, sake, and sushi. After all, over generations, those things have been made in Asian societies. And there's a good reason for it. Now, wheat was domesticated, as I mentioned to you some time ago, about 7,000 years ago around Fertile Crescent. And wheat turned out to be extremely, extremely resilient in terms of, basically wheat can grow in very harsh environment. And as a consequence, wheat really conquered the continent. And that's the reason why you can find wheat all over Europe today. But rice is something else. Rice requires a much greater amount of water, rainfall, as well as more moderate or even warm temperature. And there's a very small part of the world, a very small portion of the world that allow rice cultivation with a reasonable payoff. But if you do it right, rice can generate greater payoff. It can give you greater nutrition per square meters. So where was it? Well, as it turned out, southern part of China and also Southeast Asia. Lots of rainfall and lots of water and pretty high temperature. And also rice is extremely seasonal, so you really need seasons as well. And that region met those criteria. And as a result, that region resisted this force of wheat, so that as of today, what you find is that wheat is available in much of Eurasian continent, but rice thrives in one particular part of the Eurasian continent and its periphery, like Japan. And the reason is that rice can produce much better payoff if you can do it at all. Now, wheat and rice are very different. Both are types of farming. However, wheat is much easier to grow, and it requires much larger space, and it can invade into a variety of different climatic zones. Now, rice is something else. Rice requires much greater precipitation as well as high temperature, and relative to wheat, much higher level of social coordination required. What that means is that rice is much more seasonal. So you have to plant, replant, of course, seed in some particular time of the year, typically spring. And then you have to do all sorts of things in the right time. And then in autumn, you have to harvest within very short period of time. And throughout, water is essential. Now, speaking of water, water is really a big deal. New York Times features this water problems in California today. But just you need water. And especially this can be a real problem if you are a rice grower needing lots of water, right? And one consequence is that just the irrigation system became one very necessary part of rice farming. And once you get irrigation system, that creates lots of social differences. Why is that? Because you really have to be part of the group. Because once you are disliked, you don't belong, you just cannot survive. So irrigation system is one example. Another example is that because rice farming is so seasonal, so social cooperation and social coordination is essential to get job done within very short period of time for seeding, planting, replanting, and harvesting. And what that means is that you again need to belong to the group so that you can help and also you'll be helped. So we hypothesized that maybe one very important reason why so-called Western civilization have been relatively more independent, whereas so-called Eastern civilizations, relatively more interdependent, might have something to do with this ecological condition, particularly what kind of subsistence system, what kind of a crop happen to be available in the two regions. Now, here's a recent paper. We looked into China. Now, rice was initiated in this area, and then presumably later on, wheat invaded China. Okay, but wheat only went to west. This western edge of the country, really this is connected to more Islamic countries today, right? And here, much colder and much more dry, so that rice cultivation, rice farming is simply impossible even today. And in old time, probably utterly impossible to grow rice. But here in this region, very temperate, moderate in temperature, and also lots of water, so that if you do it rice can be very, very profitable. And in fact, that happens, and this map illustrates that fact. So here, green area indicate rice area today. So, you know, what proportion of cultivated farmlands devoted to rice. Well, basically green shows most of the farmlands devoted to rice, and black means that most of the farmland is devoted to wheat. So, well, we just cannot go back to several thousand years ago and examine, give them, those psychological tests, those people. But what we can do is to examine regional variations. So the question is it really true that the mentality we have examined in Turkey or Japan, United States, and so on, might be found in corresponding fashion in northern China as opposed to southern China, and that's what we did. So, for example, this is this classification test that I just showed you just a moment ago. Well, actually, before going there, here, what you see is the size of the circle is different, and the size indicating how likely it is that the marriage ends in divorce. So divorce rate is indicated by the size of the circle. And here, percent of cultivated lands devoted to rice or wheat. And what you see is that the circle tends to be much larger here. Those are different provinces in China. So divorce rate tend to be higher in wheat cultivating regions traditionally, at least in the last 200 years or so, as compared to provinces which are traditionally rice growing. Now, we also did this psychological task. We did several other tasks, but this is one example. This simply shows that the region is more rice growing type, and then more likely it is that the people use more relational criterion in making this classification judgment. So this is generally consistent with the idea that rice farming tend to breed some social cooperation, interdependence, reducing divorce rate, as well as encouraging more relational judgment. All right. So what I try to do so far is to make a point that presumably over 10,000 years, there's a lot of things going on, and it's very hard to pin down everything that happened, of course. However, one major guiding force, which may have created cultural differences in mentality, which we find today might have something to do with ecology. Among others, farming, that's important. That tends to generate more interdependent mentality. And also within farming category, wheat or rice farming may have some instrumental role in encouraging contemporary psychological difference. And by the way, herding and wheat farming are closely related because wheat tend to require much larger space, And in fact, wheat regions in China are also hardening regions too. At least they are adjacent to each other. So actually, in the China study, it's very hard to sort out whether it's really wheat farming alone or it might be related somehow to herding as well.
To what?
Herding, cattle, seed, herding, sorry, yeah. All right, so now I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is the question of whether any genetics might be involved in this. Again, 10,000 years is not really that long period of time, and surely it's too short to expect different species emerge out of, say, a human being. But at the same time, 10,000 years are not really that short time if you are just talking about just a mutation at the level of polymorphisms. You know, there are 23,000 genes, and each of them consists of many, many, many millions of DNAs. And we are now talking about mutation of maybe single DNA or some chunk of DNA, very small chunk. And those mutations can happen and do happen every day, well, probably very often. And many of them will be corrected right away because our genetic system are equipped with a very good correction system, you know, as you might expect. But some mutations just survive. And some mutations, and mutations which survive may not have much consequences, but some mutations may have some consequences. Some mutations may kill people before they reach some, mature age so that they can reproduce, so they cannot reproduce. Or some other mutations may have some benefit. One very interesting case illustrating this is lactose tolerance. So if you are brought up living in pastoral herding area, at least if not now, surely if your ancestors are living in wonderful cheese production areas in Europe, the chance is that you can digest milk in the morning. The reason is that typically, enzyme that digest milk called lactase. Lactase gene is shut up after a few years of life, after weaning. However, some mutations happened independently in different parts of the world, pastoral area of the world, so that adaptation happens so that people living in those pastoral areas become capable of digesting milk without any problem, and this had a very clear survival implications. And so now, contemporary world, clear indication that some genes have been selected over the last 10,000 years for sure, and some further look at the data clearly shows that some genetic change like this can sweep the population very, very quickly, probably several hundred or surely 1,000 or 2,000 years. So it's very possible that some genetic factors is involved in all this. What is that? Now, one idea I'd like to discuss today, this is by no means established because it's new. And just maybe very speculative, but I found it very, very interesting, and surely I appreciate your input. So as humans began farming or herding about 10,000 years ago, they began forming big groups, presumably. And surely that's true. You know, after several thousand years, there emerged large civilizations, right? Egypt or China, large, place, large group. Now, one major adaptational challenge was to create social cooperation, social ties, beyond immediate kinship ties. If you are helping somebody who's connected genetically, you are helping kin, say helping your son or say helping your daughter, That's easy in some way because it's very much like helping yourself in just a somewhat smaller proportion, right? But what's the point of me helping you or helping you without any genetic connection? And this previous arrangement in terms of kinship doesn't work as well. And the question is exactly what happened in order to overcome this limit, to expand the size of the group beyond the limit posed by this kinship relationship consideration. One clear answer to it is to say the social norm, and probably religion was involved. Religion was a very potent way to institute social norms, that is God watching you, for example. That was very potent force. But if it is really a social norm, and then there might be some genetic predispositions which might allow you to respond more or less to social norms. Genetic predispositions that allow you or that predispose you to respond more to social norms might have been selected in some way. So that's a core of speculation I like to suggest. Now, it would follow, given our contemporary knowledge about genetics and neuroscience, it would follow that maybe one particular kinds of genes we might want to look into is dopamine system genes. Why is that? Well, Kent Berich is sitting in the back, but Kent and many other people investigated dopamine system in the brain, and dopamine is very abundantly available in the brain, but only in some particular parts of the brain. One part that's very interesting and important is the reward processing area. And the other part, which is equally important, is prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex, that's very important because that's essentially, what makes your brain power high or low. So executive functions are very much connected to prefrontal functions, prefrontal area, and reward processing is related to this striatal, ventral stratum, nucleus accumbens, and that area. I'll show you where that is in a minute. And both of those features, psychological characteristics, are absolutely necessary to make adequate inferences about social norms, as well as responding to social rewards, compliment, praise, and so on, and track such social rewards, so as to make sure that you can get better ideas of which rules might make better sense. Here's a dopamine system in very, very simplified way. And by no means I claim that I know the system, but essentially dopamine is a neurotransmitter, meaning that information is transmitted from one neuron to the next. So this is a presynaptic end of the neuron, and there are many genes which are involved in the production of dopamine. Here, DA is a way to designate dopamine. And here, postsynaptic end of the next cell, and again, there are many genes related to receptive end of the dopamine transmission. And dopamine is spit out and presumably sending information, and dopamine may have to be brought back. That's why this transporter genes are regulating. And finally, dopamines may be cleared from synaptic cleft, sometimes recycled, sometimes thrown away. And that's exactly what those additional genes might be working very hard on. Now, one particular gene that we decided to look into is this gene, dopamine D4 receptor gene, DRD4, which is one of the most popular genes in psychology today because this gene somehow generates lots of interesting results. And what this does is to regulate the effectiveness of dopamine signaling at the receptive end of the synaptic cleft, right? Now, DRD4 is very interesting in one respect and extremely unusual. As I mentioned to you, gene is a very complicated structure consisting of millions of DNAs, right? Now, one particular region of this DRD4 gene called exon 3, which is third exon, there's a lot of variations. This is not single nucleotide SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, which is just a switch of one single alphabet. No. What's happening here is that here 48 base pair varying number tandem repeat polymorphisms. What this means is that 48 pairs of alphabet, right? Those bases are repeated several times in many different varieties. So some of you may have only 2 repeats, some other of you may have 3 repeats, and so on, all the way up to 11 repeats. Something like this is extremely unusual and very interesting. Now, as it turned out, there are a few things to note. First of all, 4 repeat is most common. This is based on available data. And 7 repeat is the next most frequent, at least in Western population. And 2 repeat is the next most frequent, again, at least in Western population. And in Asian population, this frequency is much higher. That's very interesting. Why that might be the case, we can speculate, but later, only later. Now, one very interesting thing to note is that 2 repeat, 4 repeat, and 7 repeats are very different in terms of dopamine signaling efficiency. Right? Now, very paradoxically, 4 is least effective, and 2 and 7 are relatively more effective. And actually, 7 is the most effective, and 4 is right in between. And you can demonstrate this in very, seemingly simple, but must be very complicated physiological neuroscience experiments. All right. And as I mentioned to you, dopamine is available in prefrontal cortex and reward processing region. Here I'm illustrating. Prefrontal cortex is here, and reward processing region much deeper here. And those areas are governed by dopamine, and different receptors are available in different parts of the brain. But overall, dopamine effectiveness increases. It stands to reason that people may well become more responsive to rewards, and also people become more capable of exercising executive functions, including inferences involved in, inferences about social norms. So out of this, we might expect that as compared to 4 repeat, 7 and 2 repeat variant carriers might be more sensitive to social norms. Now, I'm just running too quickly. Well, there are 2 actually competing interpretations in the literature today. One is those 7 or 2 repeat allele as a risk allele hypothesis, which would say that, okay, those alleles increase reward sensitivity, which may generate greater impulsivity. And if you are very impulsive, you cannot wait for, great dessert or great something, and you just end up doing socially inappropriate. Sounds familiar, right? So maybe ADHD, for example, is relatively more frequent for 7 repeat carriers within the United States. So something like this, evidence like this, is used as a support for this 7 repeat or 2 repeat as a risk allele hypothesis. Alternative is social norm sensitivity hypothesis, which I said, especially if you are brought up in very well-organized environment. Your caregivers need to make sure that bad things like pornographic magazines, chocolate chip cookies, all those things are not easily available. Instead, your behavior needs to be adequate and properly reinforced, right, in very systematic and careful way. And then, actually, carriers of 7 repeat or 2 repeat tend to be much more well-behaving as compared to 4 repeat carriers. So outcome of inheriting 7 repeat or 2 repeat appears to be contingent on environmental input, particularly social norm. And so this is consistent with the idea that dopamine, particularly high dopamine signaling genes, might encourage acquisition of social norms. And here's old data, just 5 years old or several years old, that illustrate this plasticity allele hypothesis. So here, the study was done in Oregon, and simply giving questionnaires and interviews to determine how 4 years old or 5 years old are behaving daily. Some kids are very impulsive and seeking very strong, intense pleasure. Some other kids are much better socialized, very calm, and do not pursue immediate pleasure right away. Now, they also tested, examined, came up with an index of parenting. Some parents are very good in parenting. High quality parenting is offered by those people, and some other parents are low in parenting style. And what you see is that for kids who are not carrying 7 repeat, really there's no effects of parenting style. But kids who are carrying 7 repeat allele show very different consequences depending on which kind of parents they have. And of course, parents and kids are genetically related, so study like this is inherently limited. But more recently, there are some intervention studies to nail this same conclusion. That is, environmental input has much greater impact on 7 repeat allele carriers. Now here we are not talking about 2 repeat carriers because most of the studies are done in the Western world. And in Western populations, there are very few 2 repeat carriers. If you do the same study in Asia, you really have to replace this with 2 repeat carriers because there are very few 7 repeat carriers. And instead, 2 repeat seems like a good, adequate replacement of those people. Now, on the basis of this, I gave you, Psych 101 style lecture about what DRD4 is and what it might do. On the basis of this, we have suggested that there might have been co-evolution of extended social network, social cooperation, and norm sensitivity over the course of the previous 10,000 years or so. And there are 3 different pieces of evidence for this. First of all, now it's possible after sequencing of whole human genome, it's possible to tell around which time those different alleles have been incorporated into the human genome of different groups of people. Isn't that amazing? You can do it, it's just you need some steps. Meaning that it's not like I can do it, but in principle, you can do it. And the best estimate people have for those 3 alleles is the following. 4 repeat allele is the most ancient form, given the best evidence available across all populations known. But interestingly, 7 repeat was incorporated into the genome of the group about 50,000 years ago. Isn't that interesting? Well, that could be just coincidence, but that's when people began spreading out of Africa. And then 2 repeat was incorporated into human genome about, this is wrong, 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago. Isn't that interesting? Well, maybe that's just coincidence, but that's when, our ancestors began farming and herding. So this is very indirect evidence. Nonetheless, the evidence is consistent with the idea that DRD4 variable number repeat polymorphisms might have co-evolved with culture as we know it today. Here's second piece of evidence, which is surprisingly systematic relationship between prevalence of 2 repeat or 7 repeat in the population and immigration distance, which typically means distance from Africa, although this doesn't have to be the case. You can immigrate from one part of the continent to the next, or in the case of Africa, you can travel all the way down to south, right? But nonetheless, overall, evidence is very clear that frequency of 2 repeat and 7 repeat increase systematically as a function of distance from Africa. So some African tribes are located here. Those are all contemporary tribes. And then folks in Asia say this is Yakut, and Japanese here, Han Chinese here, Cambodian here. And of course, data is extremely variable, but nonetheless, there's a relationship. Those people are living far away from Africa. And finally, here, indigenous peoples in South America. 7 repeat, 2 repeat, much greater, actually 7 repeat in this case, much higher in proportion. And there are 2 interpretations. One interpretation would argue that maybe DRD4 is something like the frontier gene. So 7 repeat or 2 repeat may be more like carriers may be more likely to immigrate. After all, they could be impulsive, they could be seeking more novelty, and so on. And this might, something like this may have been involved. Another possibility might point out the connection between DRD4 and norm sensitivity. So the argument could go like this. So 7 or 2 repeat carriers may be more likely to be sensitive to social norms due to their increased ability to infer social norms and track reinforcement. So they may help, these alleles may help form a more cohesive social group, and presumably, only presumably, group size may have mattered, and once you can form cohesive groups, that may have helped the likelihood of survival. And of course, this is consistent with gene culture coevolution hypothesis. So recently, Carolyn Yoon is sitting here, and Steve Thompson is here. We decided to look into this possibility in any way possible. Of course, you cannot do everything, but you can do something by way of testing some general line of reasoning like this. And one idea we had is that if this is really true, people may end up acquiring very different social norms if they are carrying 7 repeat or 2 repeat alleles. They are sensitive to social norms, but social norms are different, they may become very different. Now, 4 repeat allele carriers may be relatively oblivious to societal or normative differences. And from the very beginning of my talk, you might remember that we know that European Americans tend to be more independent and Asians tend to be interdependent, so we thought, why not combine those two? So let's look at Asians and European Americans in Ann Arbor to see if their endorsement of social norms or their psychological propensities and so on might vary as a function of not only of genes, but not only of culture, but as a function of interaction between those two variables. So what we did was very straightforward, using several self-report scales designed to assess different aspects of independence. or different aspects of interdependence. And as it turned out, those scales cohere pretty well, so that one factor, independence, exists, and the other factor, interdependence, can be clearly identified. And then we just looked at whether endorsement or tendency toward independence or interdependence might vary as a function of culture, cultural origin, heritage, and also genotypes, DRD4 polymorphisms. And here's what we found. First of all, we looked at non-carriers of 7-repeat or 2-repeat. And as you can see, you kind of see the tendency in the predicted direction, but this is nowhere near as significant, and essentially no difference. But when we looked at carriers of 7-repeat or 2-repeat, cultural difference was quite sizable, so that European Americans carrying those dopamine genes, alleles, tend to be very independent, whereas Asians carrying the same genotype, same alleles, tend to be very interdependent. And this seems pretty consistent with the idea that those alleles of DRD4 might have something to do with the acquisition of cultural traits, because they are very sensitive to social norms. So, is this genetic determinism? Well, not really. We are saying that ecology encourages, and in the meanwhile, genes intervene to magnify some of those effects. And in fact, if you think about the whole issue in this way, genetics can be a great resource of information that can be used to disentangle mechanisms linking culture to psychological processes. And well, in my talk today, I looked into, say, something like reinforcement learning. Kind of learning of culture mediated by dopamine system, which might provide one very interesting link between culture and personality and our behavior. Now, future directions, well, I think it's very interesting to link all this to health. Adjusting to different cultures may have very different health consequences. For example, conscientiousness or extraversion are known to be related to independence. Now, is it really true that this is related to health? Or alternatively, we know that neuroticism or agreeableness are related to interdependence. Do we know that it is related to health? Now, health is an interesting issue. And, well, you can say that you are healthy. That doesn't mean that you are really healthy. One real golden standard of the literature today is subjective well-being. But if you're happy, are you healthy? Who knows? Maybe those are correlated, but probably not perfect indicator of health. And recently, we have looked into inflammation and also cardiovascular malfunction as an indicator of health. Inflammation is very interesting. Inflammation is this defense reaction to bacteria when you got injury. But if you continuously get social injury, your honor lost, or your pride tarnished, and so on. And then inflammation really began to destroy your blood vessels initially, and then can begin to destroy or cause harm on your cardiovascular system. And once your cardiovascular system gets messed up, it's very hard to deal with health issues. So recently we published this paper examining connection between anger and health indicators in different cultures. As it turned out, the relationship is remarkably different across cultures. So again, the same reasoning and the same kind of idea might apply in this case. So it'd be very interesting to examine health with different indicators. And I think something like this is on the horizon. And in connection to this, dopamine system genes, maybe many of them, could be very usefully utilized to address exact mechanisms. So I think I end up spending too much time, so lots of people involved in the project, and well, we need more money, but we got some money already. So thank you very much. So, any questions, comments?
I'm wondering about this almost like a contradiction in the 7R repeat in promoting both impulsivity, risk-taking, aggression, things that are considered socially bad, we want to reduce, as well as greater social conformity. And I'm wondering, what is the explanation for that? Is this a sensitivity issue where those who are more sensitive to their environments will be sort of more reactive? So if you're in an unpredictable or harsh environment, those people are becoming more extreme in terms of aggression and such. But if they're in a stable environment, they might be more socially cohesive than those without the wheel?
Yeah, I think all sorts of different functions exist, but my working hypothesis is that over the course of the last several thousand years, when people strive to create well-functioning groups, high dopamine genotype carriers may have played a very important role in consolidating social norms and rules to establish cohesive social group. So those people can function very well within that niche humans created. Of course, if they kicked out and they are, abandoned in an inner city, right, or somewhere in Highland in, American South, they may become awful. Awful in our standard, right? So those things happen, and so it's very hard to pin down exactly what functions those genes or genotypes might have. But one very important function in the context of modern civilization might be to encourage social norms, or might reinforce, kind of as social systems based on social rules. Speculation. Yes?
I was just curious about if there was any work on intra-individual flexibility. So for the 2-7 repeat characters, if they were to change cultures, if they would be better able to pick up the new cultural norms of the place where they live. So if you start in an interdependent culture and move to an independent culture, or vice versa, if it would be harder for you to change or easier?
Well, I wish I knew. When Steve Sumi came here, he talked about a serotonin transporter gene primarily, but serotonin transporter gene is very similar. And his main point is that intervention can reverse the course. However, that point needs to be qualified because he's just looking at very young monkeys. So the question is whether that kind of flexibility can survive after, say, puberty. Or, I'm afraid that I have to say that if you are carrying high dopamine genotype and going through culture A in your puberty years, you may get stuck in that culture for the rest of life. That's alternative hypothesis. And right now, I don't know any data. Just you have to examine immigrants, for example. Or some intervention studies are useful, but most of the intervention studies available are focusing on young kids. And those intervention does work. So that's good. Yeah. Any? Yes.
I just, to go back to the beginning of independence and interdependence, history and time, partly because of what I've been reading, just my recreational reading lately, but as you were talking, I was thinking of Roman times and earlier times where there was very elaborate cities, very elaborate social structures, Aztec civilizations, Inca civilizations that were not, throwing rice and so on. So I wonder how how carefully we have to sort out the timelines across history and the kinds of dependencies and interdependencies. The Roman system was very elaborate in terms of, number one, the amount of road building, all the other things, the cities that were built, the cities that were controlled. So there was, and of course that came a little later, but it still goes back even to some of the Greek times. So we have that, I think a need to sort that timeline.
I completely agree. And just it's a formidable challenge to triangulate that sort of historical data and kind of data we are dealing with here. So hopefully, eventually, some consistent stories can be given, but hard to
There's no question
tell.
about the rice. I mean, what involves in rice and others,
Right.
but these are the factors.
Yeah, and one more extremely important thing consideration is a consideration given by Jared Diamond, human immigration, immunity against germs, and the ability to create, produce steel and all that. And, I just glossed over all of that in my talk today.
Challenging.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess my question is, would you expect the effect of like the social norm, accentuation effect of the 7-2 repeaters in the East Asian cultures to be stronger than in the West, because the fit between paying attention to social norms and collectivism is a little conceptually fits better than individuals. Like you might become more individualistic by paying attention to the social norms in that area, but there's also aspects of that culture that...
Well, it's fascinating. I always wondered why 7 repeat is so rare in East Asia. That's exceptional, absolutely exceptional. 7 repeat increase in frequency fairly monotonically as a function of migratory distance, but clearly in East Asia there's a big drop. And instead, 2 repeat was invented, right, about 10,000 years ago. And in terms of chemistry of it, 2 repeat is not as effective as 7 repeat. And yet, it's just as effective or as effective enough for rice farmers. It's possible. And maybe 7 repeat might be too effective to make people carriers too impulsive unless care is given. And in fact, just a simple questionnaire study would show that impulsivity or narcissism, those traits correlate well with independence.
Impulsivity and what?
Impulsivity, personality trait, or narcissism. Narcissism. So, those are kind of extreme form of independence, presumably, which are not socially appropriate. So again, I'm just speculating too much, far beyond whatever data exists might allow me to say. But some speculation and possible exploration along this line could be very interesting. Alan?
We could think of one contrast as being how competitive or cooperative people are. There we expect high cooperation among farmers, maybe lower cooperation among herders. But I was wondering, you could also think about being oriented towards social things and non-social things. So somebody who's concerned with prestige is oriented towards something social because prestige doesn't exist at an individual level.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if things that are social and competitive contrast in the sort of way you were, that competition and cooperation contrast.
That's interesting. Well, once you are living in very closely knit social group, many factors come about to complicate the whole thing. So for one thing, something like social comparison tend to be more important for Asians. Well, you might agree or disagree. She's doing that kind of research. And
for that is?
yeah, competition, social comparison. Now, social comparison may or may not lead to overt competition. Sure, competition can excite you and can, generate greater testosterone, and all this can follow, and much of this may be related to competition for social prestige or social ranking. Surely there's something like this exists in chimps and monkeys for sure. And in the case of humans, all this is decorated within more elaborate social norms. And I don't know. Well, before Dick Nisbet and I had some conversation about culture of honor. Might be culture of honor, honor culture that he studies. Yeah, very social. Now, is it more independent or independence related, or more interdependence related? And I think we decided to say that honor culture is kind of orthogonal to independence, interdependence. That's how we decide, we seek harmony between Dick and myself. No, I don't know. But in any event, so just a whole lot of research need to be done and more theorizing required. Clearly honor culture exists in many areas as a function of, the absence of police power and portable wealth. And once you have those two, honor culture, comes up all the time. So I still think that this dimension may be orthogonal to some extent, and that's pretty understudied today in this area of research. It would be very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
I was going to ask, is the dopamine story unique to DRD4, or are there other dopamine-related genes like presynaptic, postsynaptic, or glial cells that tell us a consistent story?
Well, that's an interesting question. Only empirical study can tell. But now we have some initial data telling some contradictory stories. And now I showed you this cultural value, social orientation data. Now, after we published this, we genotyped additional genes which are implicated in dopamine system, such as DAT1, that's transporter, COMT gene, which essentially clean the system, and MAOB, which also involved in cleaning and so on. And as it turned out, that phenomenon is dependent entirely on DRD4. Not really. I mean, we didn't study all the genes, so who knows, right? But among those several genes, only DRD4 is responsible. Now, we also looked at some different phenomena. One of them is some neural brain wave indicator of how important self is. I don't go into too much detail, but in that measure, those several genes appears to have cumulative effects. So DRD4 alone doesn't have anything, and COMT gene alone doesn't have anything, but in combination, several such genes have very systematic gene by culture interaction effects. Now, why that's the case, I don't know. Maybe small sample size, just you need to increase sample, or there might be some interesting story to be made on more substantive ground. At this point, I just don't know. Yeah, interesting. Any
other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, regarding the 7 versus 2 issue, I wonder if they're localized equilibrium. Like, I don't know what the mechanism of inheritance is, but if both 7 and 2 are better than 4, if you were going to get from 2 to 7, you'd have to pass through 4. So it's like a hurdle that'd be more difficult to cross. So they might have just stabilized at those ends.
It's interesting. I don't know really genetics of mutation, exactly how those repeat variants happen. So it's not clear if you really have to go through the intermediate types before you can achieve. Not necessarily 11 is better than 2. Those are different types, and one possibility is that those different types spring up, generated almost randomly all the time, and folks who are carrying one type or the other type just happen to be doing very well under some certain ecological or cultural conditions. So, having said that, I'm not sure. So you could be right, but I don't know. Okay. All right, so thank you so much.